The cold wind moved through the empty fields like a whisper from the past as 18-year-old Emily Carter stood alone at the rustic gate of a forgotten vegetable farm in rural Kansas, United States. The wooden sign hanging crooked on the fence had almost completely faded, and the fields beyond it were covered with weeds taller than her shoulders. Broken irrigation pipes lay scattered across the dry soil, and an old barn leaned slightly to one side, as if it had grown tired of standing. For years, no one had touched the land, and most people in the nearby town believed it would never grow anything again. Yet that broken farm was now the only thing Emily owned in the entire world. Just 2 months earlier, she had been sleeping on a worn bench at a small bus station with nothing but a backpack and a thin blanket. Now she held a letter in her trembling hands, confirming that the abandoned farm had been left to her by a grandmother she barely remembered. Standing there at the gate, she felt a strange mixture of fear, hope, and disbelief, because the same people who had ignored her when she was homeless were now watching, quietly wondering what an 18-year-old girl with nothing could possibly do with a dying farm. Before we continue this emotional story, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel if you believe that silent heroes deserve second chances, and that sometimes the people with the least are the ones capable of building something truly extraordinary. Emily Carter had grown up in a struggling Christian family in the small town of Hutchinson, Kansas. Her father, Michael Carter, had worked long, exhausting days driving delivery trucks, while her mother, Rebecca, volunteered at their local church, helping families who were going through difficult times. They never had much money, but they had kindness, faith, and a deep belief that hard work could slowly build a better life. For most of her childhood, Emily believed that life would always remain simple but safe. That belief collapsed when a terrible highway accident took both of her parents during her senior year of high school. The loss left her emotionally shattered and financially alone. With no close relatives willing to take responsibility and no savings to fall back on, she soon found herself moving between temporary shelters until even those options disappeared. By the time Emily turned 18, she was officially on her own. For several weeks, she slept wherever she could find safety, sometimes under the roof of a bus station, sometimes inside a quiet church hallway, when the doors were left unlocked late at night. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear slowly began to break her confidence, but deep inside her remained a small voice that refused to give up. That voice became louder the day she received a phone call from a lawyer in Wichita. The man explained that her grandmother, Margaret Carter, who had lived quietly outside town, had passed away and left behind an old vegetable farm. Emily barely remembered her grandmother because the elderly woman had lived a private life far from the city, but according to the documents, she had chosen Emily as the only person to inherit the land. When Emily first arrived at the property, she almost believed a mistake had been made. The farm looked lifeless and forgotten. The soil was dry, the irrigation system had collapsed, and the barn roof had several holes where rainwater had poured through for years. Most people who saw the place believed it would cost more money to repair than the land was worth. Some neighbors even whispered that the girl who had once been homeless would probably sell the property quickly just to survive. But Emily surprised them. Instead of selling the farm, she moved into the old barn. The first nights were cold and uncomfortable. The barn smelled of dust, old wood, and rusted tools that had not been touched for decades. Emily cleaned a small corner and placed her sleeping bag beside a narrow window where sunlight could reach in the morning. She spent her days walking slowly across the fields, studying the soil and the remains of old irrigation lines. Her parents had never been farmers, but she remembered stories from church about patience, faith, and planting seeds even when the ground looked hopeless. So Emily began with the simplest task possible. She started clearing weeds. For hours each day, she pulled stubborn roots from the dry earth using nothing but an old shovel she found leaning against the barn wall. The work was exhausting and progress seemed painfully slow, but something strange began to happen as the weeks passed. Beneath the layers of weeds, the soil was not dead at all. In fact, the land still held deep, dark earth that could grow vegetables if it received proper care. Emily spent evenings reading old farming guides she borrowed from a public library in town. She studied soil health, irrigation methods, and simple techniques for restoring abandoned farmland. Because she had almost no money, she relied on creativity and patience instead of expensive equipment. She repaired sections of the irrigation pipes using spare metal pieces from the barn. She collected rainwater in large barrels placed under the broken roof edges and slowly rebuilt small channels to guide the water toward the fields. The neighbors watched quietly from a distance. Some of them still believed she would fail. But one elderly farmer named Daniel Brooks noticed something different about the young girl working alone in the fields every day. Daniel had spent his entire life growing vegetables, and he understood how difficult farming could be even for experienced people. Yet he also recognized determination when he saw it. One afternoon, he drove his old pickup truck to the edge of Emily's property and observed the rows of newly cleared soil stretching across the land. The work was far from perfect, but it showed patience, effort, and careful planning. Without making a big announcement, Daniel began leaving small, helpful gifts near the farm gate. One week, it was a bag of high-quality vegetable seeds. Another week, it was a box of basic gardening tools that he no longer needed. Emily never knew exactly who had been helping her, but each small gift gave her the strength to continue. By early spring, the first rows of vegetables had been planted. Tomatoes, carrots, lettuce, cucumbers, and beans slowly began pushing through the soil. At first, the plants looked fragile against the wide Kansas sky, but Emily protected them, carefully watering them every morning before sunrise and checking the soil moisture every evening before sunset. The transformation of the farm slowly became visible to everyone in the area. Where there had once been tall weeds and broken pipes, there were now neat rows of growing vegetables stretching across the land. The old barn had been repaired just enough to stand strong again, and the rainwater system Emily built provided steady irrigation during dry weeks. Months later, the first harvest arrived. Bright red tomatoes filled wooden crates, while fresh green lettuce leaves stacked neatly in baskets Emily had woven herself from dried grasses near the river. She loaded the vegetables into a borrowed truck and drove to the weekend farmers market in town, not knowing whether anyone would even stop at her small stand. What happened next shocked everyone. Customers quickly noticed the freshness and quality of her vegetables. Many of them were surprised to learn that the produce came from the abandoned Carter farm that had been considered useless for years. Within hours, most of her vegetables had sold out, and local restaurant owners began asking if she could supply them regularly. The girl who had once slept on a bus station bench was now running a growing farm business. Over the next 2 years, Emily expanded the farm using the same careful approach that had saved the land in the beginning. She planted more vegetable varieties, built a small greenhouse from recycled materials, and eventually hired a few part-time workers from the community, including teenagers who needed their first jobs. The farm that once looked abandoned became one of the most productive small vegetable farms in the county. But the most meaningful change came when Emily used a portion of her earnings to create a small program that helped homeless teenagers learn farming skills and find safe temporary housing inside the renovated barn. She never forgot where she had started. Before we reach the end of this inspiring story, take a moment to comment below and tell us which country you are watching from and whether you believe one determined person can truly change their future. Years later, when people drove past the Carter farm, they no longer saw broken fences or empty fields. Instead, they saw green rows of vegetables stretching across healthy soil, workers moving between the crops, and a young woman standing near the gate greeting visitors with a calm, confident smile. Emily Carter had taken the one thing the world expected her to fail with and turned it into something that fed families, helped struggling teenagers, and restored land that everyone else had abandoned. And every harvest season, the fields quietly reminded the town of a powerful truth. Sometimes the most extraordinary growth begins in the life of someone the world once overlooked. Seedling.